philosopher of science, biology, also with interest in cognitive science and in actually more broad interest in philosophy in general. He's working at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's published widely on a range of topics in the philosophy of science. He's mostly known for his work on modeling. He's published many papers on modeling. He has done work around the topic of modeling on imagination. He just published an edited volume called The Scientific Imagination, which I highly recommend, which was very well reviewed recently. He has published on explanation, on robustness, on the causal order, on debunking explanation of moral realism, and so on and so forth. It's in the best journals in philosophy and in philosophy of science. He's been with us for a semester already. We can't have too much of him, so he's going to stay for us yet another semester, and in fact, a year and a half. So because next year he will be a senior visiting fellow here at the center, and we've been really delighted to be able to steal him from Jerusalem for actually 2 years. Thanks for coming. Today is going to be talking about approximating Bayes.
Thanks, Edward. Thanks for the presentation. I'm happy to be speaking today. Like Edward said, a lot of my work focuses on modeling and explanation in the life sciences. And so in one way, this talk is a bit tangential to those interests, but it's also connected to a notion that is central in the modeling context, that of approximation. At least it figures in one part of cognitive science. That part is the Bayesian approach, which has become quite prominent in recent years. Here's a compact summary of the Bayesian approach given by some of its key advocates or players in this area. Griffiths, Kemp, and Tenenbaum say many aspects of cognition can be formulated as problems of induction. Given some observed data about the world, the mind draws conclusions about the underlying process or structure that gave rise to these data, and then uses that knowledge to make predictive judgments about new cases. Bayesian inference is a rational engine for solving such problems within a probabilistic framework, and consequently is the heart of most probabilistic models of cognition. Now, this summary, as you can see, was published around 50 years ago, and around that time, Bayesian inference was applied to cognition in a pretty direct and straightforward way. Just to say, it was assumed roughly that many cognitive tasks, for perception through all sorts of reasoning and learning tasks, take basically the form of computing Bayesian posterior as is, right? Or as such. Our brains somehow encode priors and likelihoods, and then calculate the relevant posterior given incoming, typically perceptual evidence. That straightforward way of applying Bayes to cognition met with quite a bit of criticism. And one central critique, there were others, but one central critique was that in many cases, Bayesian inference is very demanding. It was a question of sort of critique of tractability. The hypothesis space for any real world sort of problem is typically very large, and computing the actual posterior in real time was seen to be infeasible, intractable. And the response from many people in this area was to appeal to approximation. So nowadays, you see models that don't depict the mind as carrying out Bayesian computation per se. Instead, you see appeal to algorithms that are known to approximate Bayesian inference, like Monte Carlo simulations and various numerical methods. And these models that are sort of couched in terms of approximation have become the kind of mainstay or mainstream of work in the Bayesian sort of framework. Now, philosophers haven't given much attention to this fact, this notion of approximation, at least as a sort of in the context of cognitive science. I think it's worth thinking more about. And what I'm going to do today is to take a first kind of step in that direction. The thing I want to focus on is basically one of the more basic questions you can ask about this, and that's sort of what is basically this idea of approximation? What does it mean to speak of the mind as approximating Bayesian inference? So here, for instance, just to show you what I have in mind, here's Sam Gershman. He's a computational cognitive psychologist at Harvard. He's done quite a bit of work on the Bayesian framework, within the Bayesian framework. And in this recent book, which is, by the way, a very nice, fun, accessible book, I recommend it. At one point in the book, he recounts the story of how Stanislas Ulam, the Polish-American mathematician, took part in the Manhattan Project and came up with the Monte Carlo method. He recounts the story of how Ulam came up with the Monte Carlo method. Essentially, to briefly recount it, Ulam was, I think, lying in bed after some operation or something like that. He was playing solitaire, and suddenly the thought occurred to him that instead of explicitly calculating the probability for various plays, he could lay out a sufficiently large number of plays randomly and just check which plays came up most often. And quickly he realized that this could be applied to problems they were handling and or having a hard time handling in the Manhattan Project, problems having to do with neutrons and their diffusion. So Gershman tells this story in a bit more detail, and then he draws a parallel with between this and certain aspects of cognition, and he makes the following comment: the neural population is approximating the inference problem in much the same way that Ulam alighted upon when thinking about solitaire and neutron diffusion. Right? Drawing this kind of parallel. And later on, he says this more sort of directly. He says, the brain approximates Bayesian inference by sampling. So this is the kind of locution, the kind of sort of statement, claim that I want to be focusing on. And I should say that when I first came across this, it didn't seem like a very complicated or puzzling thing to say, but as I thought more about it, it became a bit sort of puzzling to me. I mean, it seems that Gershman is not making a claim, or I think it's pretty clear, he's not making a claim about models. He's making a claim about the brain. But what exactly is that claim? I mean, what fact about the brain makes it the case that it's approximating Bayes by doing something else? You can ask more generally, what does it mean for the mind to approximate X by means of Y? So that's the kind of question I want to be discussing. I can't say I have a settled answer, but I want to suggest a few possible interpretations. And all of them, I think, have problems. If you have other suggestions, or if you think one of the interpretations, some of the problems are not that serious, I'd be more than happy to hear that. Before I get to these interpretations, I want to say a bit more about the topic and also give a couple of examples to give you a better feel for how these models work and what's at stake. So the sort of claim I sort of am wondering, I'm asking about, has the form of the brain approximates function X by means of computing Y. And in the cases I'll be discussing, X is Bayes' formula, Bayes' rule. I'll get to the approximations later. I take it for granted that the fact that a model contains something that serves as an approximation in the model isn't enough to justify this kind of claim. In other words, if I'm a model builder and I use an approximation method that in the course of building my model, that in and of itself doesn't license the claim that the thing being modeled is approximated. So a model of the spread of a viral disease, or a model of this sort of Pittsburgh weather, can use approximations. In fact, these kinds of models typically do use various approximations. But of course, we wouldn't just based on that fact say that the viruses are approximating anything, or that the weather is approximating anything, right? The modelers are using the approximations, but the thing being modeled, that's yet a further claim. And in these kinds of cases, I think it's not a very plausible claim. Now, you might think I'm sort of fussing over the wording of claims and not much hangs on this, but I want to sort of convince you that there is something that's at stake here. And maybe to that end, let's look at this, a portion of that quote that I began with from Griffiths, Kemp, and Tenenbaum. One thing you can see in this kind of quotation is a sort of big picture message, right? The mind is a Bayesian inference engine. And this sort of picture is very often emphasized in review articles, textbooks. There are a couple of more popular texts that have come out recently and that emphasize this picture. And part of the interest in this kind of big picture has to do with the status of Bayesian principles in epistemology. And partly because of a kind of contrast between the big picture coming out of this work and older big pictures, which emphasize irrationality and probabilistic sort of fallacies we tend to make and so on. And so the appeal to approximations, one aspect of it is a kind of attempt, it kind of helps to retain this big picture and sort of allow people to continue holding it. It also has methodological relevance. As Griffiths and colleagues here say, Bayesian inference is the heart of most probabilistic models of cognition. And one thing they definitely mean by this is that in practice, many projects in this area begin with a model that assumes Bayesian inference and then tweak it to accommodate various deviations, tractability issues, and so on. People often appeal to optimality considerations in this context, or to various evolutionary considerations. Lotem and I have a paper in the works, at least, that targets those issues, and I'm not going to elaborate on them here. But I think that part of what approximation talk in this context does is allow you to retain this sort of methodology. You start from Bayes and then tweak it. Okay, so those are at least two reasons why I think this discussion sort of matters, and these claims matter. All right, now to make this a little bit less abstract, I want to give a couple of examples. Just a couple of examples. There's many others that I could give. This just to give you a feel of how this type of work proceeds. And both examples appeal to approximations that are an instance of a class of approximations that is the most common in this literature, as far as I know, and that's sampling approximations, where the basic idea is that instead of computing a posterior distribution, you somehow sample from the posterior, and then you average or take the mode or something like that, and do some procedure on the samples to estimate the posterior. So one common form of this is Monte Carlo simulation that I mentioned, and I'll come back to in a bit. And usually, I'll mention this because I'll come back to it later, the key to success in these type of sampling approximations is to use many samples. That's an important aspect of Monte Carlo simulations and other instances in this sort of category. Okay, so one example comes from perceptual decision making, which is a kind of bread and butter topic in the Bayesian literature, one of the most common tasks that these types of models target. In a simple case of perceptual decision making, you get subjects to indicate whether or not a certain stimulus is present in their visual field, typically in a setting in which there is some uncertainty. The thing is flashed quickly, there may be some distractors, so it's not, there's some uncertainty involved, and subjects need to say present or absent about a certain stimulus. In this case, it's the kind of tilted oval that you see here. A bona fide Bayesian observer should basically report that the target is present whenever the probability of the target being present exceeds that of the target being absent. But this, at least in many cases, is a pretty hard computation to do in real time. And so people appeal to approximation. Here's an example from some recent work by Stengard and Vanderberg. They compare, it's an interesting paper in part because they compare a range of models of this task, not just Bayesian ones. But one model that they highlight and they seem to favor is one that suggests that instead of evaluating the probability of the targets being present, what this kind of perceptual decision making does is work by a kind of sampling approximation. Basically, it flips a coin that's biased towards heads, target present, with a probability that's equal to the actual posterior. It flips the coin multiple times, and it says yes, target present if there's more heads than tails, more yeses than nos in this coin. Right, and then they suggest that this model is experimentally sort of better than what they call a flawless Bayesian model. I'm not going to get into the sort of empirical aspect of this. It's a nice, I think, and simple example of this sort of general strategy. Instead of doing what the model does is it doesn't attribute to the decision maker full Bayesian computation. Instead, does a kind of shortcut, takes a few samples, and in this case, basically takes the majority verdict, right, of these coins. Here's another example of a very well-known paper in the Bayesian literature that tackles intuitive physics, which is a term that people use to refer to the ability, our ability to sort of predict simple physical scenarios and outcomes. Suppose you're shown a tower of bricks like this, and you're asked whether it'll fall over. Psychologists used to think that people do these tasks like this or other simple physical scenarios using various simple heuristics. But Bayesians in recent years have argued that we're more sophisticated and more systematic than this. In particular, we have a kind of underlying ability to simulate the physical process, using roughly speaking Newtonian principles. And then we do some kind of Bayesian computation on top of that. We do a kind of estimate the probability that this physical process will go one way rather than another. In this case, then it will go fall over rather than not. This, however, is a complicated physical task. We have uncertainty regarding the exact location and exact mass of the bricks. And so we need to run a lot of like Bayesian computation to arrive at an actual sort of true uncertainty estimate here. So what this model from Battaglia and colleagues does is they say, well, we'll assume that what people do on top of the physical sort of simulation is a kind of Monte Carlo process. Basically, we'll run it a few times and average over the results. In fact, and they argue that this kind of model fits better than older heuristic models, fits certain experimental results that they experiments that they ran better than these heuristic models that used to be accepted in this field. It's noteworthy, and I'll come back to this, that the Monte Carlo simulation the model sort of attributes here is run a very small number of times. Right? They say one or a few times in their kind of supplementary information. I looked this up. They estimate 3 to 7 runs of the simulation, and then averaging the process averages over that. Okay, so those were meant to be 2 examples of sort of similar but not identical models that appeal to approximation. So here's the main question restated slightly in light of the examples that I just gave. Suppose you build a model of some aspect of human cognition, like perceptual decision making or like intuitive physical reasoning. And suppose that according to this model, the process is one in which a certain computation is run multiple times, and then the results are averaged to give a point estimate. The modeler arrived at this in a kind of top-down way through Bayesian analysis, thinking of how one would get an estimate in a tractable way, and then appealing to some known approximation method from, say, physics or computer software engineering, or what have you. So it's pretty easy to see, I think, why from the modeler's perspective, this is a correct description to say this is a model that approximates Bayesian inference. But what justifies the claim that the mind approximates? Right? So what justifies a claim like this? This is, I think, a very clear statement of this claim by Sanborn and some colleagues who review these sampling models. They say the idea is that the brain carries out approximate probabilistic reasoning through local sampling rather than through intractable Bayesian calculations. I think there are sort of 3 possible sort of interpretations or rationales that I want to go through. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not sure either of them is a great way of understanding this claim, but let's see what you think. Okay, so one of these, basically one of these sees approximation as an input-output relation. The second is a kind of structural similarity, and the third in a kind of more informal way of doing the best one can. There may be others, as I said, and if you have ideas, I'd be interested to hear them. So the first thing that might come to mind, I think, when you think of approximation, is that a model like this shows us that model like the ones I looked at shows us that by sampling, the mind gets close to the actual posterior. Right? So in other words, the mind approximates Bayes insofar as it gets the answer approximately as a Bayesian observer, which takes, as I say, approximation to be a kind of input-output relation. And I think that's often the sense in which approximation is used, at least in certain parts of certain scientific applications, certain mathematical applications. It's the sense in which, for instance, a Taylor series is a way of approximating a polynomial. And in fact, it's the way in which, in sense in which a Monte Carlo approximation is an approximation, right? These are ways of getting at the right output. To be a bit more precise, if we have a function f, then an approximation A is a formal method that, under well-specified conditions, allows you to come close to f, typically as close as you'd like, arbitrarily close. It matters here that, you know, the well-specified conditions bit is highlighted for a reason, and that's it, because in the majority of cases, at least, in Bayesian cognitive science, the conditions under which the approximation gets to the right output aren't met. And in fact, like I said in the Battaglia paper, they mentioned that they assume that Monte Carlo simulation is run a handful of times, right? Which is orders of magnitude less than you'd see in normal applications. And that's for a good reason, because it's the same considerations, the same tractability considerations that motivate the appeal to approximation that also mean that it's implausible to think that the mind would run 100,000 runs of this kind of simulation, right? It's the same sort of thought that motivates both the appeal to approximations in the first place and the thought that these approximations are run in a kind of efficient, small number of instances way. All right, so for this reason, I think that even though this is an attractive and a common notion of approximation, it can't really be what's going on in this type of case. Oh, I forgot to, yeah, that's it. Okay, another interpretation, or maybe the kind of second thing that might come to mind is the approximation should be understood not in input-output terms, but in terms of a sort of process, right? It's a similar process that's going on. So maybe our minds approximate Bayes in the sense that they do something that is Bayes-like. Right? But I think this is, again, intuitively appealing and may match quite a bit of what quite a few cognitive scientists have in mind. One problem with this kind of interpretation is that it would not, I think, display a good match with potential cases of approximations, including the type of example that I mentioned before. But maybe a more serious problem is that it's really hard, I think, to make good sense of the relevant notion of structural similarity, right? And I think at a kind of sufficiently coarse-grained level, many processes of producing an estimate are Bayes-like, and the whole thing becomes a little bit kind of subjective and vague in a way that I think drains this kind of notion of content. So let me try to explain what I mean by looking back at the Stengard and Vandenberg example that I mentioned before, the one with the coin flipping algorithm for perceptual decision making. So just to remind you, what it does is flip a kind of biased coin that lands head with a probability matching that of the target's, the posterior of the target being present, a set number of times. They don't actually say exactly what number of times the model does that, as far as I can tell. And then it checks whether the majority of coin flips point in one direction rather than another. So now the bias in the coin, that's calculated by Stengard and Vandenberg in a Bayes-like way, right? They use Bayes' formula. But what they attribute to the cognitive system, to the mind that they're studying, is not such a process, right? They attribute a kind of coin flipping that happens to be relying on that same probability. And the decision process of sort of choosing the majority of sort of the mode, that seems like to me at least, as far as I can tell, that seems like not a very Bayes-like kind of process. If you think there's a better way of sort of adjudicating whether this is Bayes-like or not, I'm happy to hear that. But as far as I can tell, there's no obvious way of deciding how similar this process is to computing a Bayes' formula. There's nothing that exactly parallels likelihoods or priors. So it's kind of not that similar to the way Bayesian inference works. So for this reason, I think that this kind of comparison, well, it's just very hard to see what exactly would be underlying the comparison of structural similarity. And because of a tendency, I think, in this literature to people want to view cognition as Bayes-like, this is pretty worrying, right? There's room here for a lot of kind of subjective sort of imposition of the way one wants to view the mind onto this kind of process. I do want to say, and this is a kind of in fairness to some of this literature, there is one class of approximations in the Bayesian literature that might fare better by these lights, and that's what's sometimes called variational approximations, which are essentially cases where what you do is you go through the Bayesian inference, but you replace the prior, what you think of as the true prior, with a simpler to handle distribution, usually a Gaussian or something like that. In that kind of case, I think there is a good mapping between Bayesian inference and the approximate Bayesian inference, and there's a kind of good sense in which the two processes are structurally similar. But those approximations are rare for good reasons, and I don't think that the main examples of sampling approximations are in a good sense, in a good non-subjective sense, similar enough to Bayesian inference. So overall, I'm quite circumspect about this idea that approximation can be understood in terms of structural similarity. All right. The third and final interpretation I want to talk about doesn't relate to any kind of formal or semi-formal notion of approximation, but to a kind of more everyday idea of doing one's best or aiming for some benchmark or standard. I think in everyday context, we often talk of approximation as a kind of attempt to do something a certain way. I recently gave a talk on some related stuff at PSA, and Josh Tenenbaum was there. And after the talk, he came up and he said, look, I think this is the right way. This kind of trying to do one's best is actually the right way, if I understood him correctly, to understand approximation talk. He also pointed to this work, recent work from his lab that's relevant. So I want to go through this and say a few words about it. Basically, if you're approximating Bayes in the sense of trying one's best, then one's behavior could fall quite a bit short of Bayesian inference. But there should, I think, still be a recognizable sense in which you're tracking a Bayesian principle. So here's where this example from Tenenbaum comes in. What they claim to show, Peltz et al. In this very recent paper claim to show, is that adults, and to a certain extent also kids, can perform something like a statistical power analysis. So a principle you might regard as a kind of Bayesian learning principle is that when you face a task of discriminating between hypotheses, then the harder the hypotheses are to discriminate, the more evidence you should want. And in a more specific case, if you're sort of sampling from a target population, then the smaller the difference you're trying to discern, the larger your sample up to a point should be. And I should say, I'm using the notion of sample here because they're using the notion of sample. It's not exactly the same notion that I used before. That one was an internal sample. And this one is an external sample. I can elaborate on that later. It's not crucial, but it's not quite the same idea. Anyway, what they did is they showed subjects images of boxes like these, with different proportions of white and colored balls. and they asked them to estimate what size their sample should be if they wanted to be able to use the sample to distinguish different pairs of boxes. How many samples they need if they need to distinguish a 90-10 versus a 10-90. And on the other hand, if their task was to distinguish a 60-40 versus a 40-60, what kind of sample should they want? And the basic finding that they have is that these proportions, as they get closer, so the sample size people request grows. So as the sort of effect you're trying to discern is smaller, so the sample that people ask for is larger. They model people's decision process using a kind of Bayesian approximation in which you estimate the probability that most samples of a given size point in the direction of one option over another, but then you add a penalty based on the cost of sampling. Right? So what this kind of model basically suggests was that people will want larger samples up to the point at which the sort of cost of sampling outweighs the sample's informative. Now, in the basic form, this kind of model captures the sort of tendency that people have. They had to tweak it a little bit, and I have some concerns about the way in which they tweaked it, but I'm not going to go into those. The basic idea here is what I want to highlight. What they attribute to people is the sort of attempt to sort of meet this Bayesian principle of getting larger samples in harder tasks, but under a set of costs and constraints. So you add a kind of cost of sampling. So you're trying to do your best, or basically you're trying to do as best as it's worth doing, something like that. Okay, now there are various things to consider about this paper. Like I said, I mean, you could consider the empirical and the exact details of the modeling, but I'm not going to do into that because I'm not going to go into that because I'm sort of more interested in this underlying notion of approximation and this sort of different sets of approximation that might be going on here. You might wonder how plausible it is to say that a subject approximates a Bayesian observer to the extent that they seek larger samples when faced with harder discrimination tasks, or something more general than that. You know, you do a kind of cost-adjusted type of power analysis, or maybe even more generally, you're trying to track some Bayesian principle of learning subject to a cost-benefit analysis. And honestly, I'm not really sure what to think. And the main reason is I think that there's a kind of shift here, right? If you'll recall, the way I started out was by asking, what does it mean today for the mind to do, to approximate Bayes by means of doing some other distinct computation, like a Monte Carlo process? But here, the claim isn't quite that the underlying computation approximates Bayes, I think, but that it uses a Bayesian principle and then it adds to that a kind of cost-benefit analysis. Right? So what this model really is doing is a kind of, it's really a kind of, well, it's pretty explicitly couched in decision theoretic terms. It sort of does a utility calculation, and it's really a different form. It's more, like I said, more a form of a cost-benefit analysis model than trying to strictly track the kind of epistemic process that people go through. You might think, and I think this is what Tenenbaum and some people in this area think, that this is an advantage of the model, right? It's not a bug, it's a feature, because it takes into account the way people actually make decisions, which is not just a kind of epistemic process, but also take into account considerations of cost and related sort of not tractability, but sort of cost-benefit kind of considerations. And I think that might be right? There might be a kind of move towards realism here, but that move is also a move away from Bayesian. That's my point. Right? If you're depicting the processes more along the lines of a cost-benefit analysis, you're thereby depicting the mind as much less a kind of Bayesian in the sense that we saw before of a sort of probabilistic part of solving prediction problems that we saw before. Okay. Let me summarize what I've said and then just a couple of quick concluding comments. The main question was how to understand the idea that our minds approximate Bayesian inference by means of other computations like Monte Carlo processes, various sampling methods. And I argued that for one thing, this is unlikely to be understood in an input-output sense, simply because the mind typically doesn't, and given the tractability assumptions that motivate some of this work, can't come close to the correct posterior. And then I argued that the idea of approximation is structural similarity, computing something in a Bayes-like way. That's either too vague or unlikely to be true, maybe both in some cases. And lastly, I looked at this interpretation on which to say that the mind approximates Bayesian inference is to say that it treats it as a kind of benchmark. It tries to approach it to the extent that it's worth that this is worth it from a cost-benefit perspective, which I illustrated by this recent paper by Peltz and all. I think this sort of last interpretation may be the most plausible. It may have other things going for it, but first of all, Tannenbaum's comments notwithstanding, I don't think this is how most people in this area, most modelers, understand the notion of approximation. And more importantly, I think it's kind of misleading to describe this as a case in which our minds approximate Bayes, because in fact, it's much closer to how the kind of older heuristics literature describe people's sort of reasoning. It's kind of employing a strategy that is good enough given costs and given, you know, the target of the reasoning that's going on. So overall, I'm a little bit skeptical about all three interpretations, and I'm not sure there is a good cogent sense or interpretation for this approximation talk. But like I said at the outset, I'm happy to hear other suggestions. I just want to say just two brief things before I finish. First of all, like I said at the beginning, the claim that the mind sort of approximates Bayes is a way of retaining a certain big picture and a certain kind of top-down methodology. And so if there isn't a good interpretation of this language and this way of thinking, then I think this sort of presents a problem, a kind of damages this big picture and the methodology that's associated with it. Secondly, I think that in principle statements of the sort, the mind approximates X by means of Y, in principle, those can be applied in other cognitive contexts. And the same kinds of claim and potentially similar kinds of interpretive problems might arise elsewhere. So I think it's just worth noticing this. And at the very least, I hope to sort of call attention to this way of thinking in the Bayesian context and maybe sort of more generally where it exists. Thank you.
We have another time for questions. We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll just continue.
For a long reason.
You only learn something from what they say back to you. You already know what you think.
That's good. But people, everyone likes to read and play. Only when you go into like
Thank you. And in the business, right? Graduate students on their internet. Really, first big mistake.
I can see like
That's right. They want more, they'll ask for more. And if they don't want more, you're.
Make sure you say the most important thing first,
Absolutely.
because they're going to be interrupted within
Absolutely.
2 to 4 minutes tops. So, like,
Absolutely.
if you have like 2 or 3 things that you have to say, it'll have to be really the first thing you
That's
say.
right.
no,
It's pretty hard, actually. It's quite hard to do.
Practice with me. I'm so hard on them, but they do better, you know, because.
But it's hard. It's one of these introductions.
Poetry, there's.
What a horrible study, the last one.
I think it's horrible.
I mean, look at the data. It's flat.
Yeah.
It's nothing flat except for 50 and 90 marks. It's basically flat. It's basically flat. Basically for most of the range.
First of all, I agree there's like problems with the way with the fit, but they have different models. So
No, but I'm not talking about the model, I'm talking about
No,
human
but-
performance.
but they're taking the experiment in different way. So if you look, they do get, which I think is it's much nicer, kind of linear. But what they want is subtly, they want it to go this way.
It's I don't know it. It's a plateau. It's a plateau.
Right, but I'm saying that there are other we did several models, and they did different experiments to test the different models. And the one that is linear, which is not the model they want to advocate for. So that's why they also do different models.
Whoa.
Like you want to have a situation where people they have more, then at some point it becomes like not cost effective, so they either don't ask for samples or ask for samples.
Yeah.
And that they don't get. And they have to, so one thing that's worrying about this is they do what everyone is.
I mean, I guess I didn't found point. I mean, we know from like tons of work.
I tried to come to your talk, but I had a doctor. So I didn't take.
That's not you don't do
It's a wrong doctor, so I made a different doctor, which made.
People have feedback. You know, right.
I'm here for your function.
Not I'm giving instruction. That's my point. And people
Maybe I
do
should
this.
talk to you.
Except for exactly.
I did try, I was there in my car. Like,
Oh, first of all, well, okay, I don't want to defend this business, right? Because I think, like I said, I think one of the problems here is that they then go back and fit it to, I think it was a conceptual.
Yeah.
Right, which is.
Yes,
but,
it's one option.
I think it still matters that these are pretty far in.
But yes, it's a plateau. So you see,
Should I get it down?
you have flat, you have a decrease, and you have flat.
It's not a plateau, I mean, this is a.
No. But I mean, okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, but it's the one of the range. No, but one of the range. You can see, I mean, you know, if nothing functions from here to here, okay, you're getting flat.
It's got a kind of, yeah, so maybe the best thing.
I know, it's.
That would feel, I don't know how that would fare, if you said, people have a sense of. You know, when the stuff becomes quite hard, they want.
Yeah, I think that I think probably for likelihood was like a real full on conference and a lot of people.
By Calvin first speak, that's how.
Yeah.
I did try to make consistent.
What's the bars?
I agree, I don't know though, what.
I'm just thinking about why shouldn't you? Let people who think good at it myself, don't know how to do it. You can't take that computer really there.
I did eat a banana.
Maybe.
No,
Critical of this.
it's no, I still like
When I
people
confused, and I think there are good ways.
It's just like all of the inbound stuff at my percent.
Always.
Well, I think this is anything you know.
Not a big fan of George. I know that, so.
I'm gonna ask the big question.
You can ask the big question.
The kind of question you ask, because I don't know anything about these three tests. I'm gonna ask a detailed three question. I asked the kind of question. What are you? I am trying to- Actually.
The question could be.
And I was like, I could demonstrate the world. It's good, you guys are happy for it.
It's not my country.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Well, my other country is doing very well. I'm playing twice. I've got like 2 tickets. That's how. Yeah, no.
Oh, my God.
I know, I think like, okay. All right, please raise your hand if you've got any questions. You're already on it. We're going to start.
Yeah, but this is something I mentioned to you last week, which is I'm curious about the project. So the project of saying the brain approximates Bayesian reasoning. What's the contrast class here? Instead of doing what? Is one of the questions I have. And then it reminded me of all of this work of Gigerentzer's on both challenging the kind of Kahneman-Tversky claims that humans aren't rational because they don't know how to make these kinds of inferences from basic logical inferences. And it kind of Gigerenzer says, well, but you're giving them the wrong, you're giving them the wrong ingredients to see whether or not they're reasoning like rational that. And then later these arguments about how psychologists think people reason according to statistical probabilistic models. And they don't really get the model. So the question is, what kinds of options does the person engaged in this business have when they're looking at what the brain is doing, which can be interpreted, of course, many different ways in terms of inference making? What are the kinds of options they're having? And is Bayesian the best of the lot? I mean, are they more like a Bayesian? And that was a different kind of notion of approximating. They approximate Bayesianism better than they approximate all the other kinds of candidates that we have for inference drawing here. Okay. So that was my question. What are the other kinds? If it's not approximating Bayesianism, is it doing something else that we would call it inference? Drawing inferences according to some other set of rules? That's the question.
I mean, the contrast you mentioned is a very important contrast that these people actually, address themselves. That namely the heuristics of various sorts. Some of them, I mean, Gigerenzer, some of his favorite examples, don't quite fit here. They wouldn't quite be the right kinds of contrast to draw here. But stuff of that from that family, right? So not all of these. This one in particular didn't like look at other non-Bayesian type of models. But the one like, for instance, this one, that's essentially what the paper is doing. It's looking at model fit over a whole range of models. I don't remember how many, but like maybe 15 or something like that. And half or so of those are what you might think of as various forms of heuristic. And they're, as I say, it's not quite the stuff that Gigerenzer typically focuses on, like the stuff about what comes to mind first and that kind of type of heuristic. But it is a form of heuristic thinking, and they argue that this kind of approximate Bayesian inference fits the data better. That's just one model, one type of data. So that's why I didn't want to go into that. But this is a crucial contrast. Now, in some cases, it will be hard to say, given that we're not supposed to be doing Bayesian inference, is it the case that what we're doing is more similar to Bayes than to others? Right. They just use here like model selection criteria, right? So they don't have a kind of notion of similarity in the background. They kind of use this sort of, I think, a Kaiki model selection formula, and they just give a number, right? Which model is more similar to the data, but that's not, it's not a kind of similarity that I have in mind.
Brendan?
Yeah, so at the end you mentioned that not being clear about what it means for the mind to approximate Bayes is potentially a problem, not just for the Bayesian approach, but just for top-down methodology.
I'm not sure if top-down